A lot of exciting updates this week in the React Native world. First, we got React Native 77, well, really 0.77 because we're never quite getting to 1.0. But this is a pretty cool release and I do want to go through it. The second one is Reanimated 4, another exciting release for reasons that are very close to me, and I'll show you why. And at the end, hopefully, if there's time, I'll actually show you some things that aren't publicly released or documented. So let's get started and just look at the release for React Native 77. We got new styling features, Android's 16 kilobyte page support, and Swift template. So this release ships several features. New styling capabilities, such as support for display contents, box sizing, mixed blend mode, and outline related properties to provide more powerful layout options. I'm so excited for mixed blend mode and display contents. Both are really great. Display contents is going to be awesome for building component libraries that maybe inject props or some other activity like it, like gestures and touchables. Box sizing and outline, don't really use them often myself, but I guess outline can be beneficial when I want to set it to 0 on buttons on web. But it is really great to see that these new CSS styles are coming into React Native Core. It's something that I push for all the time. In the previous version of React Native, we actually got things like filters, although we didn't get the best ones in my opinion, like saturation and blur and stuff like that, but definitely going in the right direction and kind of getting parity with the web, which we've seen before. So I'll just kind of go through these. If you're not familiar with display contents, I'll read through this here. The display contents prop allows an element to disappear from the layout structure while its children are still rendered as if they were direct children of the parent element. It can be useful for styling purposes where you wanted to apply styles to child elements without affecting the layout when building the wrapper components, which must handle events, or if you need to interact with the shadow tree. Technically speaking, display contents renders an element without generating a layout box, but it preserves the layout boxes of element's children. The element with display contents is effectively flattened out of the view hierarchy. Okay, so here they show an example of what it looks like. A really useful use case on the web is, generally speaking, I'll put a div and I'll want to scope some CSS variables to its children, but I don't actually want it to affect the children at all. That's a pretty obvious case because it's as if it's a context provider, but that's actually happening on the DOM level and not on the React level. So in this case, they're showing me like if I have this view and then a widget. Okay, so it shows this red box. And now we're going to build an alerting component, which I see next. And the background color is blue. Got it. And so I see that here. And it also, when you do on pointer down, it calls this alert function. All right, so naturally what you might be thinking here is like, I might want to have this on pointer down functionality, but I don't actually want it to like affect the children. And this is actually really relevant for me when I'm building Zigo. If you haven't seen Zigo before, it's a context and drop-down menu component. And so Zigo has this component, which is the trigger. And it makes sense in some ways for the trigger to apply styles to the child, but in other ways, not really. Like, I just want it to be something that traps when you long press something, but I don't necessarily want to like inject a layout box. Like in some cases, I just want you to like have your own view, and this just like applies, actions, listeners, things like that to it. So that's where display contents is very useful. So you can see here that in their example, this alerts box has a background of blue. But it says here, if we try this again while setting display contents on the view wrapper of alerting, we only see alerts when the user presses within the original bounds of the widget. Right, okay. So right now, when you do display contents on this alerting component, it actually no longer has a layout, right? So now you lose this blue box, and clicking in that area where the blue box was before does nothing because this action is actually just applying to the box that's within it. So that's pretty cool. Up next is box sizing. If you've used web, you probably know this is just like the CSS reset, unless there's some exceptions where you just set border box. I've actually never used content box myself. I'm sure they're pretty useful cases for it, and generally speaking, I think it's great that this exists. I don't have too much to add here, but you can see in the graphic what the differences are. Now, next is CSS mixed blend mode. Super excited for this. This is awesome that they just added this. I think that adding modern CSS properties is really like the biggest shortcoming of React Native over the last like 4 or 5 years, where it kind of fell short. And things started to pick up, I want to say around a year ago, and then they added Flex Gap. I could be messing up the timeline, but that really got me excited because it was the most necessary style for adding good layouts. but it was totally missing. And we've been getting these more modern CSS properties now. Mixed blend mode is super slept on for design. I think that you can do a lot of really cool stuff for it. It also nicely integrates with something like Figma. So if you're making a cool design in Figma and you want to apply something like color dodge or darken or soft light or difference, exclusion, all these things, you now can kind of bring your Figma styles over to React Native. So I wonder if they have an example here. Yeah, they do. So look at this. This is so cool. You can just take any view, image, whatever you might have, and apply these very nice different styles to it. So mixed blend mode, really, really great addition. And then lastly, they added outline. Again, I'm used to just setting outline 0 on buttons or things like that, unless it's focus visible on web or is something of that sort. But this actually is great. Generally speaking, something we've lacked in React Native is like good shadows, multiple shadows, being able to style things around the edge that don't actually affect the box. As it says here, the outline props are very similar to border, but it's rendered around the border box as opposed to around the padding box. So I'm sure you know that it goes like padding, border, margin, and the outline goes outside of the border as opposed to out of the padding box, which is actually quite useful. Okay, now on to Android version 15 support and 16 kilobyte page support. I'll be totally honest, I don't know what this is. So forced edge to edge on Android 15. We've already done some work to support Android 15 on the prior release. One of the noticeable changes in Android 15 is forced edge-to-edge display when you build apps with Target SDK 35. If you've not looked into this yet, please refer to the recommendation on how this should be handled. Okay, so if you're using React Native Safe Area Context, sounds like this is already handled for you. I feel like that's most apps. And then next, 16 kilobyte page support for Android. Let's see. Android 15 introduces 16 kilobyte memory page size, enabling performance improvements for apps and more, but making previous 4 kilobyte based apps potentially incompatible on future devices. Okay, so with the new release, React Native supports this new page size, and you can check that out on Android if that's something relevant to you. And well, now we get to the parts of the release that are a little bit less relevant, in my opinion. Command line stuff, deprecations. This is like what the release notes once upon a time always looked like and would get me a bit disappointed. And I really feel like since the new architecture got out and a few of these styles have been getting out, the release notes have been getting much better. And that's something that I think as a community is very important, that you see the release notes are things that you would actually use. Okay, so they're removing some things from the command line. There's a Swift template now for iOS. That's pretty awesome. So, if you've been using something like Nitro from Margello or Expo modules, you've already been using Swift. And here it says projects using Expo should not be affected by this change. Looks like in this version, they removed the A and I keyboard shortcuts from Metro. And now they've slimmed down the community template with a single app delegate with Swift instead of these other files. I assume is Objective-C. Yeah, Objective-C to Swift. Okay, cool. There's some limitations. If you're using Expo, this part is not relevant to you. And you can dig into the docs if this is something that you're touching, these Objective-C files. Okay, so some breaking changes. Native looping animations don't send React state updates whenever the loop ends. I'm going to be honest. Who's using the React Native Animation API? Like, everyone's using Reanimated, right? I'm not saying they shouldn't release this or announce it, but I'm asking you to please use Reanimated or Modi or something like it. And I'm going to touch on that up next. As you know, I built a library called Modi, which is built on top of Reanimated and lets you basically do whatever Reanimated can do, but it's simpler, it's easier to work with, and it looks a bit more like Framer Motion on the web. And one of the big things I've always wanted from Reanimated is CSS transitions and keyframe animations. Okay, so I gave a talk a few months ago, I guess now it's actually a year ago, in Poland called React Native 2030. And I'll see if I can skip to the part where I talk about animations. So when I built Modi, it was in large part inspired by CSS transitions, just being one line, super simple, not a lot of imports. You don't need hooks like use animated style and stuff like that. And this is one of the things that I said we should have in React Native built in.
For built-in transitions for native. We can see here that opacity is updated based on this visible prop. To make the
This is
opacity
super
animate
meta.
when it changes, all we need to do is add it to the transition property.
Okay, so opacity, you can just see it changes the value, transition property, and duration. If you're coming from web and you see that, you're like, yeah, what's the big deal? Just let me show you Reanimated 1 with blocks and cons and eeks and all these functions you had to use or just the animated API where you have to set up an effect and have an animated value and pass it. It's a nightmare. So Modi kind of set out to solve some of those things, just make the API easier to use while still getting to use the reanimated benefits. Okay, and so similarly here, you could have an animation keyframe. These are both just APIs that I proposed in this talk as part of a list of features I wanted to have in React Native. Okay, so how does that relate to Reanimated 4? Well, as you could guess, they just released CSS transitions and CSS animations built into their components. I'm really excited to see this. Today, we are publishing the first beta version of Reanimated 4, the next generation of our library for building smooth, high-performance animations and dynamic user interactions in React Native. Worklets revolutionized how we build animations in React Native, introducing a paradigm shift in declarative APIs developers knew from earlier versions of Reanimated. Okay, the shift to declarative was life-changing. If you use Reanimated 1, you've been doing React Native for too long, and let me tell you, it was a nightmare. Okay, your best bet was to watch Will's Can It Be Done in React Native videos, which were amazing, but you had to like have a PhD in this stuff. And Software Mansion really did a great job bringing this into the 21st century of APIs. Okay, so I'm going to get down to the good stuff, which says here, many React Native developers are already familiar with CSS. And there's a wealth of examples and resources you can look up online to help them create animations. With Reanimated 4, you can look up CSS animation code, bring it into React Native, and see it in action. Terms and conditions apply. Okay, this is like really epic. They basically re-implemented the CSS animations and transitions in C++. It's really cool. We're going to go through it here. This only works with the new architecture, and it's still compatible with Reanimated 3. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't this suck that I have to go to the new architecture? It has some issues with some libraries. This is actually great that it only works with the new architecture because it's a sign that it's actually implemented on the native side, and this isn't just like syntax sugar. Our goal is to continue building the success that Reanimated has achieved. CSS animations are incredibly powerful for many scenarios, but they rely on a fire and forget model, which means they cannot respond to dynamic external factors in real time. Yep, makes sense. This limitation makes it poorly suited for certain use cases in React Native, such as animations tied to gestures, screen transitions, or elements like the appearing virtual keyboard, where continuous real-time control and platform native integration are essential. Totally understand that. I think that Modi also lets you kind of drop into a lot of these more low-level scenarios and gestures, and it's really nice to just have a component set that lets you do both. It's on the web, we also have frame motion, right? And you can't do everything with these CSS transitions and animations, but in many cases, it is very nice. In fact, this is in some ways a bit of a level up from CSS keyframes because you can actually do them in line. Like CSS keyframes, you have to either have some library that abstracts that for you, but like you have to name them and then like reference the name. And so you have to have a CSS file, and it's like pretty annoying. You can't just in React pass an animation dictionary. Okay, so now it says to try it today. My one feedback would be to just put the code block way earlier. I feel like we've gotten pretty far in the article and still don't even know what it looks like. But finally, we're seeing here, okay, transition property. Let's make this a little bit bigger. You can see that this is just a component with transition property width and duration, and you click it and it updates. And this all happens on the native thread, on the UI thread. It's fast. That's the crucial detail here, right? It's all implemented on the native side. The one other nice thing is they actually put out a tool that lets you literally go from CSS keyframes and transitions into the reanimated one. I see they have css.create. My assumption is that this is actually based on StyleX, which I can pull up in a sec. So if I were to look up React strict DOM, we have HTML, but if I look, I guess they don't have a search set up, styling components. Yeah, so you see we have CSS and css.create, which under the hood is actually just, I think, re-exporting StyleX, which is the styling engine that's underlying all this for React strict DOM, which actually works on web and native. So I appreciate that they basically seem to be matching the spec from this. React strict DOM is really setting the guidelines for us, and a lot of exciting things to come out from there. But back to this, very nice that they kind of have this helpers. You can go through a bunch of these examples. I'll click on it here. It's got a little Monaco editor on the left, and it'll give you these transition properties that you can copy in. It would be nice, honestly, to get this shorthand example here, where like you kind of should be able to just use this in React Native, in my opinion, just a single line. But of course, the problem is that example, like I was saying before, you need to name them. It's pretty annoying. So in this case, I think you'd actually have to like do the dictionary and give it the keyframes in line. Okay. While we're happy with the overall shape of this beta release, we want to note that some structural changes will be made to the repository to improve its modularization. These changes aim to reduce the library footprint, particularly on web where this is much more critical. Our goal is to extract different aspects of Reanimated's functionality into separate packages that can be imported individually. For example, new CSS animations core, the worklet-based API, and Reanimated's layout animations will be available as standalone imports. At the same time, the main package, React Native Reanimated, will continue to provide the full set of APIs and remain compatible with Reanimated 3 to support existing projects. That's awesome news. Really like to see this. I actually had a pull request that was merged a while ago into Reanimated that was essentially tied to tree shaking and ensuring a smaller bundle size on web. We actually reduced the Next.js bundle size with tree shaking by something like 80%. Let's see if I can find this pull request here. It's from like, I want to say 2022. The problem is that I feel like the test didn't really stand for it. Yeah, reduce bundle size on web by 80%. So this is actually a pretty, I mean, 26 files. Like all you had to do is pull files out that had side effects. And then we had to basically do export alias as default, a few little changes like that. But it's just nice to see that they're actually bringing this as a core principle into the library because it's so shaky and you make like one little change and all the tree shaking can break. So as long as there are tests and above all standalone imports, then as a library like Modi, you're not as worried about issues like tree shaking because you can just import it directly from the correct places and it'll all just work. So very exciting. I think this is one of the big steps in getting to this React Native 2030 vision. I mean, I had my two big things were modern CSS, which like is starting to get there, right? We still need the blur view, we still need the blur view, we still need the mask, we still need a few of these things. But I just saw that we got background image with linear gradient support and multiple gradients, thanks to Nishan, who put that into React Native. It isn't part of React Native 77. I couldn't tell you why. My guess is that there's some sort of timeline and whole like slow release process for getting new PRs into this. But I would assume it's in the next version, unless I missed something and it was in the previous one. But I think that this was just merged. So if I go here to 76, I don't see it there either. It looks like we're gonna get multiple linear gradients directly in the style prop soon. Now, the other day, I tweeted that I was excited about a number of things. One of them being first class support for SwiftUI. And I had a bunch of people hit me up asking me like, how can I use this? Where's the announcement for this? And if you Google SwiftUI React Native, you're not going to see any announcement. It's not in React Native 77. It's not announced in Expo SDK 52, but that doesn't mean it's not available in that SDK. So I'm going to pull up this library, Expo Mesh Gradient. Now, if you go to the README, you're not seeing too much. If you go to this docs link, it's actually going to take you to a broken link. But if you do what I always like to do, which is just poke around the pull requests, if you go into Expo's GitHub here, go to Expo Mesh Gradient, you see this new package, okay? Now, it only has iOS. So clearly something here is going on. I'm aware of the mesh gradient component in SwiftUI. I follow the SwiftUI components very closely because I'm always very jealous of them that they get released and it's too hard for me to use. So if I go to the source, I literally am just getting this one export. It's just calling the native component. So let's look at what we've got here. Got the pod spec, so only 3 Swift files here. That's all that really matters. So all right, let's check out mesh gradient props. This is literally just having like a types.ts file. It's just exporting the props that we're going to use from the React Native side. Okay. Now we'll go to mesh gradient module. Again, this is literally just providing the module, just kind of like boilerplate. All right, so let's go to the last remaining file, which is mesh gradient view. And I'll bring your attention to two things here, okay? Import SwiftUI, and this is a SwiftUI, Expo SwiftUI view. Here we have a 38 line file, 38 lines, and you get a mesh gradient. All right, it doesn't work on Android, it doesn't work on web yet, but built-in SwiftUI, okay, this is like pretty slept on. And so those props that we looked at before from the other file, they're just referenced right here. Side note, it's always so weird to me how in Swift you don't import stuff. Like everything's basically globally accessible. It definitely looks prettier with the imports, but like this mesh gradient props, it's coming from here and like it's not imported. I don't know. Oh, I kind of glossed over this. There's also expo SwiftUI.view props. So my guess is that's extending the views props and passing them down, something like that. So anyway, back to the mesh gradient view. Here it creates a Z stack, It checks if the gradient's available because it's iOS 18. If it is, it calls the mesh gradient, has some safe area logic. Otherwise, it calls any view with an empty view. And this is the part I want to bring your attention to. So here it's saying if props.mask, okay, this is pretty clear. It adds a mask if someone passes that, and it returns children. Okay, where's that coming from? This is super cool. It reminds me of like a slot component in these routing libraries. You can you can pass the props children. Now this pull request here, all this work is done by Tomas, and I had been asking him for like 2 years. How can we get SwiftUI support in React Native so that I can just plug this stuff in? And the biggest problem we always talked about was children. Like it's really hard. Like how do you wrap these children because there are alignment issues, all kinds of problems, right? So one of the ones I was really excited about was like using SwiftUI to apply blur filters to components without needing to do something like a Skia view or something where you're kind of dropping out of a normal React Native view that has typical layout. All right, so let's check this out. Again, for the record, I am no expert in Swift, but we're just poking around because this is how you tend to learn. And it's basically extending the SwiftUI view is my understanding from this, and it has a props type that you can get on it. Here we have public extension expo Swift UI view, and it has this function called children. All right, and we have a Z stack, and it sets the alignment to top leading, and then it loops over props.children. Okay, and here it's just, I guess, returning the item. Now, it's pretty interesting because I think that this basically just lets you kind of, again, globally override. So let's take a look around these files. SwiftUI child, and this, I think, is where the magic is happening. We have this extension expo SwiftUI, and that is a view that renders a UI kit-based React child view and manages its layout by synchronizing UI view.frame with the SwiftUI system. This is always the challenge from coming to React Native to UIKit to SwiftUI. I experienced this a little bit when I was building with Galleria. Like, how do you make the layout and the bounds match up? It's challenging. React Native sets center and bounds properties during the layout, but as per Apple Docs, this is not recommended and may result in undefined behavior. Read more in UI view representable docs. Okay, that's pretty funny that it does something that's not recommended by the Apple Docs. To fix it, we're observing for changes in bounds and then pass a new frame to SwiftUI so it can update its layout metrics and then set UI view's origin to 0 so it doesn't affect SwiftUI's layout in any way. So here we have a struct child, which I'm assuming this means it extends or implements this colon. Okay, so we've got this variable that's layout metrics, view frame observer, and we've got the actual UI view instance. And so in the init, it's getting an ID, uniquely identifying this view. It's actually setting the UI view, layout metrics, and a frame observer. I assume this is just like the resize observer on web, where it's checking when view size changes, but I think it's a little bit different because these are for layout changes specifically made by React. Okay, so in this observe function, it takes the frame it receives and it updates them on the layout metrics dot frame. And then it resets UIKit's origin to 0 so that it's fully controlled by the offset XY in SwiftUI. SwiftUI may reset it anyway, but we want this to be explicit. Okay, super interesting because then down here when it's actually getting rendered, we're seeing UI view host. Okay, so it does have a host view and you pass the view, which is this one right here, the UI view instance. And in the frame, we're using the layout metrics, which is initialized as the view.frame. And it's using the view.frame here. My assumption, and it would be great to kind of sit down with someone to explain this a little bit better. My assumption is that this file right here is where a lot of this innovation is coming from. I'm sure there are many other things that were necessary to make this all happen, but from the outside, this doesn't look too complicated, right? There aren't too many files, but it's always about finding this correct abstraction, what the missing piece was, and how to get it to all work. So here we have the UI view host. I'm actually thinking I'm going to spin up a SwiftUI project of my own, potentially to do SwiftUI charts or to try some other things. And there's actually a pretty cool project called React Native SwiftUI by Andrew, and he actually has guided me through some of these details. But this is ultimately the most important piece for me, which is the ability to just very easily go back and forth from React Native to actual native. And anytime you want to quickly whip up a SwiftUI file, you just do it. Now it's not quite the React Native 2030 vision. I don't think I can give it this because here in React Native 2030, I was saying we could import directly from a Swift file, right? With inline native modules is what I called it. And specifically for SwiftUI,
And that's why these will also let you import SwiftUI files without any additional configuration. Just write your SwiftUI components and import them and run them like a normal React component.
always feels weird to be making a video of my own talk here, but on the left, we've got this Swift file, which is literally a SwiftUI view. On the right, we have a React component, which is just importing it. We don't quite have that. I don't know what it's going to take for us to get there, but the first step, of course, is simply first class support for SwiftUI. Now, none of this has been announced quite yet. It's possible that the APIs are going to change, but I just couldn't help it. I couldn't help covering this because I saw it and I thought, wow, this is super cool. And I know that they're also going to announce Jetpack Compose for it quite soon. And so SwiftUI is coming, Jetpack Compose is coming. It's every day going to get easier to use native components. We're getting better styles. And I think we're very, very close. I think we're close to setting the groundwork for this React Native 2030 vision. I still think we need many more CSS properties. I want background clip, mask image, all these more complicated things that let you build very simple, sleek designs. Above all, I need blur filters. And as long as we have these working multiple shadows, multiple gradients, linear gradients, all that kind of stuff, we're really inching towards the web. Now, there are many open questions for the future of how this is all going to work. How is React Strict DOM going to work? At the moment, it only seems to work with its own components. So if you want to use the CSS export from React Strict DOM, you can't really pass it to normal views. And will I be able to use Reanimated components with React Strict DOM? So that's it for now. I do have some other things I want to cover soon, like performance updates in React Native core components, especially text, because I've heard that the React Native team is aware of this issue and is actually really addressing it, so I'm pretty excited about it. I want to think a little bit more about where React Strict DOM is going to fit in this entire picture because it's presenting something pretty nice for web and for native and unifying it all, especially as we get these new CSS properties. But there's plenty of unknown, and I think it's just overall an exciting week. React Native 2025 will maybe be the year when a lot of these things come to fruition. I hope we don't have to wait another 5 years, but I guess we'll see. And thanks for watching.